conclusion was inescapable. There had been egregious fraud. Barletta had been defeated by at least 4,000 votes. The U.S. ambassador's main concern was that the report not reach the press. No American official pressured Panama for a recount. The political officer's report lies somewhere in a file in the bowels of Foggy Bottom. On October 3, 1989, elements of the Panamanian Defense Forces, PDF, attempted a very short-lived military overthrow of Noriega. When they apprised U.S. officials in Panama of their plan beforehand, they were not discouraged from undertaking it. But during the execution, they received virtually no help at all, even though they had Noriega in custody for at least 2 hours and were willing to turn him over to the U.S. military. The reasons, which were later advanced by the Bush administration at different times to explain the lack of American support, included: we didn't know what was going on. We didn't think the rebels had Noriega in custody. They may have had him in custody, but they didn't want to release him to us. The U.S. military commander in Panama was not authorized to seize Noriega. Later we learned that he was. The rebels were not to our liking politically. Our hands were tied by congressional intelligence committees, and we suspected the whole thing was a ruse to provoke and embarrass the U.S. government. The U.S. military in Panama failed to block the road Loyalist forces used to rescue Noriega. The administration said later that by the time it was certain of the troop movements, it was too late. However, a convoy of Loyalist trucks rumbled by the American embassy itself. Moreover, the United States had a number of helicopters in the air, reportedly as many as a dozen, observing developments. Some reports have it that the rebels were willing to turn Noriega over to the U.S. military only if the Americans would come and grab him to make it appear that he was being seized against the will of his Panamanian captors. But the administration has denied this as well. At one point, the American embassy reported to the State Department and the CIA in Washington that the rebels wanted to turn Noriega over, and the CIA went to brief members of the Congressional Intelligence Committees. Administration officials later said that the embassy had misunderstood what the U.S. military had told it, because telephone communications in Panama were poor at the time. Did the Bush administration decline Noriega as a gift during the October coup attempt because it was determined to have its invasion? One circumstance may indicate a negative response to this question. On October 12th, U.S. officials met at the State Department with Noriega's attorney to negotiate, once again, the Panamanian peacefully stepping down from power. Nothing came of this meeting. After the U.S. invasion began at 1 a.m. on December 20th, another incident occurred which further raises the question of whether the apprehension of Noriega was the White House's sole, or even primary, concern. A European diplomat in Panama City, representing a major U.S. ally, claimed that less than 3 hours after the invasion began, he telephoned the U.S. military to inform them that Noriega was 2 houses away in the flat of his mistress's grandmother. But the military disregarded the information. The diplomat said later that he was 100% certain of Noriega's location. But when I called Southcom, the U.S. Southern Command said it had other priorities. The diplomat had met several times with Noriega and his mistress, who had recently moved into the diplomat's own apartment building. Other residents of the 2 apartment buildings confirmed the diplomat's assertion about Noriega's presence. Neither Southern Command officials nor the American embassy would respond to inquiries about the matter. Did the U.S. decline to capture Noriega in the first few hours of the invasion because it was determined to first cripple his base of power, the PDF, and score a grand military triumph that would enable George Bush to shred the wimp image that plagued him? Did military muscle have to be flexed to illustrate the need for a big combat-ready force, even in the absence of a Soviet threat, just weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall? Or to send a clear message to the people of Nicaragua, who had an election scheduled in 2 months? When George Bush and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney were asked why they had made 180-degree turns on previous explicit rejections of a war against Panama, they each referred to the same incident of the night of 16 to 17 December. According to the Defense Department, for American servicemen, unarmed and in civilian clothes, got lost and inadvertently drove up to a PDF roadblock where they were manhandled. As they drove away, they were shot at, killing one and wounding another. At the same time, an American Navy officer and his wife who witnessed this scene were roughed up considerably by the PDF. 1 year later, the Los Angeles Times reported that the incident was not the unprovoked act of aggression by the PDF portrayed by Washington. Instead, It was a step in a pattern of aggressive behavior by a small group of U.S. troops who frequently tested the patience and reaction of Panamanian forces, particularly at roadblocks, which they would dare by driving up and then refusing to stop or suddenly pulling away. The Americans in this case were not lost, and they were armed. They drove up to a very sensitive roadblock, and when told to leave the car by the PDF, the Americans all gave them the finger, shouted an obscenity, and drove off. The Panamanians then opened fire. Lending credence to this report is, oddly enough, a recorded phone conversation of a young Marine guard at the American embassy speaking to his mother in the United States the next morning. The 4 Americans, he said, were out of bounds owing to the fact that they had no reason to be there. The whole world knows that they shouldn't have gone there. They messed up. If the United States set up a barricade anywhere and someone acted in the same way, we would also start firing. There had been other provocation as well. For months prior to the incident, the United States had been engaging in military posturing in Panama. U.S. troops, bristling with assault weapons, would travel in fast-moving convoys, escorted by armored vehicles, looking for all the world as if they planned to attack someone. U.S. Marines descended from helicopters by rope to practice emergency evacuation of the embassy. Panamanian military camps were surrounded and their gates rattled amid insults by U.S. servicemen. In one episode, more than 1,000 U.S. military personnel conducted an exercise that appeared to be a rehearsal of a kidnap raid, as helicopters and jet aircraft flew low over Noriega's house and American raiders splashed ashore nearby. In late September, Gen. Max Thurman had been appointed the new commander-in-chief of the Southern Command. He was briefed by ADM William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who apprised him that there was a very high probability that Bush would call for large-scale military action in Panama in the near future. We're going to go, but I can't tell you when. After the invasion, the mother of one of the American soldiers killed said that her son had called her on December 14th to say he was going on a dangerous mission. He called to say goodbye and that he might not be home again. This was before the roadblock incident. Another serviceman, speaking to reporters after the invasion, said that the soldiers had found out about it maybe 4 or 5 days before you did. When a reporter asked when that was, an Army officer prevented the soldier from answering. It would appear from this evidence that the war had been planned before the American serviceman was shot. All that was needed was a pretext, an incident. 2 days after the incident, an off-duty American lieutenant was leaving a laundry when he was approached by a Panamanian police or Army officer. The American shot and wounded the Panamanian twice. The U.S. serviceman felt threatened, the Bush administration claimed, admitting that its earlier story that the Panamanian had pulled a gun was false. It was not reported that Panama invaded the United States as a result of this incident. Thus, it came to be that a superpower crushed one of the smallest armies in the hemisphere. It was the 7th time the United States had invaded Panama since it had kidnapped the province from Colombia in 1903 to build the canal. See Appendix 2. The new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Gen. Colin Powell, declared at the time of the invasion, "We have to put a shingle outside our door saying, 'Superpower lives here.' But the superpower still had to show a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. Accordingly, the leading legal minds of the Justice Department, the State Department, and the Defense Department put their heads together and came to the unanimous conclusion that the invasion of the sovereign nation of Panama, the abduction of its leader, and his criminal trial in the United States were all legal and proper. The invasion was called Operation Just Cause, perhaps for acts like the following carried out by the American military. Searched out and arrested hundreds of civilian supporters of Noriega, even though they did not face American or Panamanian criminal charges. Houses were broken into to apprehend some of the individuals. Forced ambulances, with emergency lights flashing and sirens sounding as they rushed patients to hospitals, to halt, to be searched for Noriega loyalists disguised as patients. Fired into the air without warning while walking through busy streets. Imposed and enforced curfews. The organized tours of Noriega's home and office for reporters to gawk at and pry into all of the man's personal belongings, from his photos to his underwear. Publicized and ridiculed everything from his sexual practices to his religious beliefs. Invaded prisons and released prisoners. The commander of the new Panamanian public force, appointed by the U.S., blamed the extraordinary wave of crime and violence that hit Panama after the invasion on what he said were hundreds of dangerous criminals freed by the U.S. He declared that the rate of assaults, murders, and other crimes was much worse than under the Noriega regime. To wearing painted faces and firing machine guns into the air, raided the Nicaraguan ambassador's home. The ambassador was wrestled to the ground. He and 7 other people were held at gunpoint while U.S. soldiers ransacked the house and confiscated weapons, $3,000 in cash and personal items. The money was never returned, the ambassador said, surrounded the Vatican embassy, where Noriega had taken sanctuary, and for several days blasted the ears of the entire neighborhood with ear-splitting rock and roll music over loudspeakers. U.S. soldiers near the Vatican embassy sang a parody of Woody Guthrie's old song. "This land is my land. That land is my land. There's no land here that isn't my land." Many Panamanians initially welcomed the U.S. intervention, reported the Los Angeles Times. But as fighting continued through a 4th day on Saturday, some reports from Panama suggested that resentment of the U.S. presence was also widespread. The Panamanian people feel more threatened since the Americans arrived than they did when Noriega still held power, an American administration official said. On the first anniversary of the invasion, Panamanians couldn't agree whether to mark the day as a holiday or a day of mourning. So President Endara proclaimed a national day of reflection. From Mexico to Argentina, Latin American governments today roundly condemned the use of force by the United States against Gen. Manuel Antonio Noriega of Panama. News report, December 20th, 1989. I appreciate the support that we've received, strong support from the United States Congress, and from our Latin American neighbors. George Bush, December 21st, 1989. The Organization of American States approved a resolution to deeply regret the military intervention in Panama by a vote of 20-1, the one being the United States. "We are outraged," said State Department spokesman Richard Boucher. The OAS, he declared, missed an historic opportunity to get beyond its traditional narrow concern with non-intervention. Afterward, during 1990, the United States was instrumental in setting up a highly secretive intelligence office with the all-encompassing name of the Council of Public Security and National Defense. The new agency was headed by a man who twice served as a senior minister in Noriega's puppet governments. A government official said that the CIA was assisting in personnel training for the new agency and that further assistance was being received from...
There's a reason I play these audiobooks when I'm meditating and doing yoga and martial arts. This story is a historically accurate documentation of Operation Just Cause. The guy who raised me, the cop who took me from my mom, even though he wasn't really my dad, was one of the soldiers who went to Panama and killed innocent people to overthrow a government that they had no business messing with. And just the other day, I met someone who was a child when all of these things happened. A college student here in FSU whose family is from Panama, who was directly negatively impacted by the actions of my father and so many other Americans who bullied and basically brutalized that country. So these things directly affect me. They directly affect you. Everyone who sees this has been at some point in their life personally harmed by the United States government, whether they realize it or not. So listen when you meditate and I play these things, and let it sink in and let it make you angry, because anger is a gift. There's a reason that your body is programmed for it. But let it be a cold, calm anger that moves you to action.
The U.S. Justice Department police training mission in Panama. Reportedly, one of the agency's missions was to gather information on troublemakers, including opposition figures organizing mass demonstrations. Another target was the newly organized National Police, formed from remnants of Noriega's old army. "We'll watch the police," said an official. "We can't let the monster arise again." This left open the question of who would watch the new agency. At the same time, the U.S. Army's 4th Psychological Operations Group established a hotline for the public to denounce Noriega backers, criminals, subversives, and anti-U.S. fighters, who were then picked up by American troops and consigned to detention camps. In December 1990, when President Guillermo Endara was faced with a military rebellion he was unable to put down, he called upon U.S. troops to intervene and quell the uprising. Endara had been sworn in as president on a U.S. military base in Panama during the invasion a year earlier. The official Pentagon study of the Panama occupation notes that the original post-invasion plans called for outright U.S. military government, with the head of the Southern Command as Panama's de facto ruler. At the last minute, a decision was made to install Endara as president, but his government was, as the study put it, merely a facade. The United States confiscated thousands of boxes of Noriega government documents and refused to hand over any of them to Panamanian investigators. The United States is protecting robbers and thieves and obstructing justice, complained the government's chief prosecutor. We are the owners of the documents. If I am to complete my work, I have to see the documents. Panamanian businessmen reported that they lost as much as $700 million because of the looting and rioting that followed the invasion, very little of it covered by insurance. 1 year after the invasion, unemployment was running at more than 25%, and invasion damage, looting, and the U.S. sanctions of 1988 to 89 had shrunk Panama's economy by 30%. The new president, one of the 2 vice presidents, and the attorney general, it turned out, all had links to drug trafficking and money laundering. By the spring of 1991, it could be reported that Colombian drug cartels and associates of Noriega had once again turned Panama into a narcotics transshipment center. There were as well far more cocaine production facilities than ever existed under Noriega, and drug use in Panama was reportedly at a far higher level. The new drug trafficking and money laundering activity centered on associates of cabinet officials, particularly in the president's and the attorney general's offices. When American officials told the Panamanians that Foreign Ministry legal advisor Julio Barrios was under U.S. investigation for money laundering, the Panamanians did nothing. Barrios was subsequently appointed to Panama's delegation for negotiations with the United States on the treaty to end money laundering. Washington insisted that Panama change its prized banking secrecy laws to facilitate U.S. efforts to pursue suspected lawbreakers, principally launderers of drug money. Panama's Comptroller General pointed out that the United States wanted Panama to pursue acts which were crimes in the U.S. but not in Panama. We can't change the whole legal system because of one thing, drugs, he argued. Eventually, after many American threats to cut off aid, Panama signed a treaty in April 1991 giving U.S. authorities partial access to Panamanian banking records and the right to prosecute individuals depositing illegal drug profits. However, foreign banks, particularly Colombian ones, found ways to circumvent the new requirements and were soon back in the money laundering business. An American helicopter gunship was strafing what it perceived to be enemies in the street. Ernesto Cubilla was in his kitchen. A stray round went through his roof. His son rushed in to find him spread out in the corner. He lost a lung and a kidney and suffered liver damage. Women and children naturally went to the window and looked out when they heard the fighting, said Roberto Troncoso, president of the Panamanian Committee for Human Rights. And the nervous American soldiers shot them. A few hours before the invasion, while all the details were being finalized, George Bush, wearing a bright red and green Christmas tie, holding his granddaughter, sang Christmas carols at a White House Christmas party. 2 days later, he declared that his heart goes out to the families of those who have died in Panama. One of Bush's advisors said that the president felt that Noriega was thumbing his nose at him. 51, Bulgaria 1990, Albania 1991, teaching communists what democracy is all about. For American anti-communist cold warriors, for Bulgarian anti-communist cold warriors, it couldn't have looked more promising. The Cold War was over. The forces of Western civilization, capitalism, and goodness had won. The Soviet Union was on the verge of falling apart. The Communist Party of Bulgaria was in disgrace. Its dictatorial leader of 35 years was being prosecuted for abuses of power. The party had changed its name, but that wouldn't fool anybody. And the country was holding its first multi-party election in 45 years. Then, the communists proceeded to win the election. For the anti-communists, the pain was unbearable. Surely some monstrous cosmic mistake had been made, a mistake which should not be allowed to stand. It should not, and it would not. Washington had expressed its interest early. In February, Secretary of State James Baker became the most senior American official to visit Bulgaria since World War II. His official schedule said he was in Bulgaria to meet with opposition leaders as well as government officials. Usually, the New York Times noted, it is listed the other way around. Baker became deeply involved in his talks with the opposition about political strategies and how to organize for an election. He also addressed a street rally organized by opposition groups, praising and encouraging the crowd. On the State Department profile of Bulgaria handed to reporters traveling with Baker, under the heading Type of Government, was written in transition. In May, 3 weeks before Election Day, a row broke out over assertions by the leader of the main opposition group. Peter Barron, Secretary of the Union of Democratic Forces, a coalition of 16 parties and movements, said that during UDF's visits to Europe and the United States, many politicians pledged that they would not provide financial assistance to a socialist Bulgaria. This would apply even if the Bulgarian Socialist Party, the renamed Communist Party, won the elections fairly. Barron stated that Western leaders want lasting contacts with governments which are building Western-style democracy and economies. The British Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, was particularly categorical. He said he was drawing up a declaration to go before the European community to refuse help for the remaining socialist governments in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the National Endowment for Democracy, Washington's specially created stand-in for the CIA, see Nicaragua chapter, with funding in this case primarily from the Agency for International Development, was pouring some $2 million into Bulgaria to influence the outcome of the election, a process the NED calls promoting democracy. This was equivalent to a foreign power injecting more than $50 million into an American electoral campaign. One major recipient of this largesse was the newspaper of the Opposition Union of Democratic Forces, Democratia, which received $233,000 worth of newsprint to allow it to increase its size and circulation for the period leading up to the national elections. The UDF itself received another $615,000 of American taxpayer money for infrastructure support and party training, material and technical support, and post-electoral assistance for the UDF's party building program. The United States made little attempt to mask its partisanship. On June 9th, the day before Election Day, the U.S. ambassador to Bulgaria, Sol Polanski, appeared on the platform of a UDF rally. Polanski, whose early government career involved intelligence research, was a man who had had more than a passing acquaintance with the CIA. Moreover, several days earlier, the State Department had taken the unusual step of publicly criticizing the Bulgarian government for what it called the inequitable distribution of resources for news outlets, especially newsprint for opposition newspapers, as if this was not a fact of life for genuine opposition forces in the United States and every other country in the world. The Bulgarian government responded that the opposition had received newsprint and access to the broadcast outlets in accordance with an agreement between the parties, adding that many of the Socialist Party's advantages, especially its financial reserves, resulted from the party's membership of 1 million, about a ninth of Bulgaria's population. The government had further provided the printing plant to publish the UDF newspaper and had given the opposition coalition the building from which to run its operations. The socialists' lead in the polls in the face of a crumbling economy perplexed the UDF, but the Bulgarian Socialist Party drew most of its support from among pensioners, farm workers, and the industrial workforce, together representing well over half the voting population. These sectors tended to associate the BSP with stability, and the party capitalized on this, pointing to the disastrous results, particularly the unemployment and inflation of shock therapy free enterprise in Russia. Although the three main parties all proposed moving toward a market economy, the socialists insisted that the changes had to be carefully controlled. How this would be manifested in practice if the BSP were in charge and had to live in an extremely capitalist world could not be predicted. What was certain, however, was that there was no way a party named Socialist, nay Communist, recently married to the Soviet Union, could win the trust and support of the West. As it turned out, after the second round of voting, the Socialists had won about 47% of the vote and 211 seats in the 400-seat parliament. the Grand National Assembly, to the UDF's 36% and 144 seats. Immediately following the first round, the opposition took to the streets with accusations of fraud, chanting, "Socialist Mafia," and "We won't work for the Reds." However, the European election observers had contrary views. "The results will reflect the will of the people," said the leader of a British observer delegation. "If I wanted to fix an election, it would be easier to do it in England than in Bulgaria. If the opposition denounces the results as manipulated, it doesn't fit in with what we've seen," a Council of Europe delegate declared. Another West European observer rejected the opposition claims as sour grapes. "Utter rot" was the term chosen by a conservative English MP to describe allegations of serious fraud. He asserted that the conduct of the poll was scrupulously fair. There were just minor incidents that were exaggerated. "The opposition appeared to be rather bad losers," concluded one Western diplomat. These opinions were shared by the many hundreds of observers, diplomats, and parliamentarians from Western Europe. Nonetheless, most of the American observers were not very happy, saying that fear and intimidation arising from the legacy of 45 years of totalitarian rule had produced psychological pressures on Bulgarian voters. "Off the record, I have real problems with this," said one of the Americans. Asked if his team's report would have been as critical had the opposition won, he replied, "That's a good question." Members of the British Parliamentary Observer Group dismissed reports that voting was marred by intimidation and other malpractices. Most complaints were either trivial or impossible to substantiate, they said. "When we asked where intimidation had taken place, it was always in the next village," said Lord Tordoff. Before the election, Socialist Prime Minister Lukyanov had called for a coalition with opposition parties if his Bulgarian Socialist Party won the election. "The new government," he said, "needs the broadest possible measure of public support if we are to carry through the necessary changes." Now victorious, he repeated the call for a coalition. But the UDF rejected the offer. There were, however, elements within the BSP which were equally opposed to a coalition. The opposition refused to accept the outcome of the voting. They were at war with the government. Street demonstrations became a daily occurrence as UDF supporters, backed by large numbers of students, built barricades and blocked traffic, and students launched a wave of strikes and sit-ins. Many of the students were acting as part of the Federation of Independent Student Societies or Associations, which had been formed before the election. The chairman of the student group, Alishare Qerechok, asserted that the organization had documentation on electoral abuses which would shortly be made public. But this does not appear to have taken place. The student movements were amongst the recipients of National Endowment for Democracy grants, to the tune of $100,000, to provide infrastructure support to the Federation of Independent Student Associations of Bulgaria to improve its outreach capacity in preparation for the national elections. The students received faxes, video and copying equipment, loudspeakers, printing equipment, and low-cost printing techniques, as well as the help of various Polish advisors, American legal advisors, and other experts, the best that NED money could buy. The first victory for the protest movement came on July 6th, less than a month after the election, when President Mladenov was forced to resign after a week of protests, including a hunger strike outside of Parliament, over his actions during an anti-governmental demonstration the previous December. His resignation came after the UDF released a videotape showing Mladenov talking to his colleagues and appearing to say, "Shouldn't we bring in the tanks?" Said a UDF official of the resignation, "We are rather happy about all this. It has thrown the socialists into chaos." The demonstrations, the protests, the agitation continued on a daily basis during July. A city of freedom consisting of more than 60 tents was set up in the center of Sofia, occupied by people who said they would stay there until all senior Bulgarian politicians who served under the old communist regime were removed. When they were denied what they considered adequate access to the media, the protesters added to their demands the resignation of the head of Bulgarian television. At one point, a huge ceremonial pyre was built in the street in which textbooks from the communist era were burnt, as well as party cards and flags. The next head to fall was that of the Interior Minister Atanas Smertjev, who resigned in a dispute over the extent to which the questioning of former dictator Todor Zhivkov should be public or behind closed doors. The Bulgarian people indeed had a lot to protest about, primarily a rapidly declining standard of living and a government without a president which seemed paralyzed and unable to enact desperately needed reforms. But the question posed by some MPs, as thousands of hostile demonstrators surrounded the parliament building during the Smerjiv affair, was, are we going to be dictated to by the street? The problem, said Prime Minister Lukyanov, is whether Parliament is a sovereign body or whether we are going to be forced to make decisions under pressure. His car was attacked as he left the building. Finally, on August 1st, the head of the UDF, Ziliu Zilev, was elected unopposed by Parliament as the new president. A few weeks later, another demand of the protesters was met. The government began to remove communist symbols, such as red stars and hammer and sickles, from buildings in Sofia. Yet, 2 days later, the headquarters of the Socialist Party was set afire as 10,000 people swarmed around it. Many of them broke into the building and ransacked it before it wound up a gutted and charred shell. The protest movement in Bulgaria was beginning to feel and smell like the general strike in British Guiana to topple Chetty-Jugan in 1962, and the campaign to undermine Salvador Allende in Chile in the early 70s, both operations of the CIA, where as soon as one demand was met, newer ones were raised, putting the government virtually under siege, hoping it would overreact, and making normal governing impossible. In Bulgaria, women demonstrated by banging pots and pans to signify the lack of food in the shops, just as women had dramatically done in Chile, and in Jamaica and Nicaragua as well, where the CIA had also financed anti-government demonstrations. In British Guiana, the Christian anti-communist crusade had come down from the US to spread the gospel and money, and similar groups had set up shop in Jamaica. In Bulgaria in August, representatives of the Free Congress Foundation, an American right-wing organization with lots of money and lots of anti-communist and religious ideology, met with about 1/3 of the opposition members in Parliament and President Zilev's chief political advisor. Zilev himself visited the FCF's Washington office the following month. The FCF, which has received money from the National Endowment for Democracy at times, had visited the Soviet Union and most of the Eastern European countries in 1989 and 1990, imparting good OL American know-how in electoral and political techniques and for shaping public policy, as well as holding seminars on the multiple charms of free enterprise. It is not known whether any of the students were aware of the fact that one of the FCF's chief Eastern European program directors, Laszlo Pastor, was a man with genuine Nazi credentials. By October, a group of American financial experts and economists, under the auspices of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, had drawn up a detailed plan for transforming Bulgaria into a supply-side free market economy, complete with timetables for implementing the plan. President Zilev said he was confident the Bulgarian government would accept virtually all the recommendations, even though the BSP held a majority in parliament. They will be eager to proceed, he said, because otherwise the government will fall. Witnesses and police claimed that Konstantin Trenchev, a fierce anti-communist who was a senior figure in the UDF and the leader of the Podkrepa Independent Trade Union, had called on a group of hardcore demonstrators to storm the BSP building during the fire. He had also called for the dissolution of parliament and presidential rule, tantamount to a coup d'etat, declared the Socialist Party. Trenchev went into hiding. Trenchev's Podkrepa Union was also being financed by the NED. $327,000 had been allocated to provide material and technical support to Bulgaria's independent trade union movement Podkrepa, and to help Podkrepa organize a voter education campaign for the local elections. There were computers and fax machines, and there were advisors to help the union get organized and gain strength. According to Podkrepa's vice president, the assistance had reached Podkrepa via the Free Trade Union Institute, set up by the AFL-CIO in 1977 as the successor to the Free Trade Union Committee, which had been formed in the 1940s to combat left-wing trade unionism in Europe. Both the FTUC and the FTUI had long had an intimate relationship with the CIA. In the first week of November, several hundred students occupied Sofia University once again, demanding now the prosecution, not merely the removal of leading figures in the former communist regime, as well as the nationalization of the Socialist Party's assets. The Prime Minister's rule was shaky. Lukyanov had threatened to step down unless he gained opposition support in Parliament for his program of economic reform. The UDF, on the other hand, was now demanding that it be allowed to dominate a new coalition government, taking the premiership and most key portfolios. Although open to a coalition, the BSP would not agree to surrender the prime minister's position. The other cabinet posts, however, were open to negotiation. The movement to topple Lukyanov was accelerating. Thousands marched and called for his resignation. University students held rallies, sit-ins, strikes, and protest fasts, now demanding the publication of the names of all former secret police informers in the university. They proclaimed their complete distrust in the ability of the government to cope with Bulgaria's political and economic crisis, and called for an end to one-party rule, a strange request in light of the desire of Lukyanov to form a coalition government. In June, the Guardian of London had described Lukyanov as Bulgaria's impressive prime minister, a skilled politician who impresses business executives, bankers, and conservative Western politicians, while maintaining popular support at home, even among the opposition. On the 23rd of November, Lukyanov barely survived a no-confidence motion, leading the UDF to storm out of parliament, announcing that they would not return for an indefinite period. 3 days later, the Podkrepa labor organization instituted a general strike, albeit not with a majority of the nation's workers. Meanwhile, the student protests continued, although some of their demands had already been partly met. The Socialist Party had agreed to restore to the state 57% of its assets, corresponding to subsidies received from the state budget under the previous regime. And the former party leader, Todor Zhivkov, was already facing trial. Some opposition leaders were not happy with the seemingly boundless student protest movement. UDF leader Petr Barin urged that since Bulgaria had embarked on the road to parliamentary democracy, the students should give democracy a chance and not resort to sit-ins. And a UDF MP added that the socialists should leave the political arena in a legal manner. They should not be forced into doing it through revolution. Student leaders dismissed these remarks out of hand. The end for Andrei Lukyanov came on November 29th, as the strike spread to members of the media, and thousands of doctors, nurses, and teachers staged demonstrations. He announced that since his proposed economic program had not received the broad support he had asked for, he had decided that it was useless to continue in office. A caretaker coalition would be set up that would lead to new general elections. Throughout the period of protest and turmoil, the United States continued to give financial assistance to various opposition forces and whispered advice on how to apply pressure to the elected leaders. The vice president of the Podkrepa Union, referring to American diplomats, said, "They wanted to help us and have helped with advice and strategy. This solidarity gave rise to hopes of future American aid." Konstantin Trenchev, the head of Podkrepa, apparently out of hiding now, confirmed that opposition activists had been assured of more U.S. assistance if they managed to wrest power from the former communists. These hopes may have had as much to do with naivete as with American support for the UDF. The Bulgarians, like other Eastern Europeans and Soviet citizens, had led very sheltered political and intellectual lives. In 1990, their ideological sophistication was scarcely above the equation. If the communist government was bad, it must have been all bad. If it was all bad, its principal enemy must have been all good. They believed such things as American government leaders could not stay in office if they lied to the people, and that reports of homelessness and the absence of national health insurance in the United States were just communist propaganda. However, the new American ambassador, H. Kenneth Hill, said that Washington officials had made it clear to Bulgarian politicians that future aid depended on democratic reform and development of an economic recovery plan acceptable to Western lenders, the same terms laid down all over Eastern Europe. The Bulgarian socialists, while not doubting Washington's commitment to exporting capitalism, did complain that the United States had at times violated democratic principles in working against the leadership chosen by the Bulgarian people. One reform-minded socialist government official contended that Americans had reacted to his party's victory as if it represented a failure of U.S. policy. The U.S. government people have not been the most clean, moral defenders of democracy here, he said. What cannot be done at home can be gotten away with in this dark, backward Balkan state. In the years since, the Bulgarian people, particularly the students, may have learned something, as the country has gone through the now familiar pattern of freely rising prices, the scrapping of subsidies on basic goods and utilities, shortages of all kinds, and IMF and World Bank demands to tighten the belts even further. Politically, there's been chaos. The UDF came to power in the next elections with the BSP a very close second. But due to the failing economy, lost a confidence vote in parliament, saw its entire cabinet resign. Then the vice president, who warned that the nation was heading for dictatorship. Finally, in July 1993, protesters prevented the president from entering his office for a month and demanded his resignation. By 1994, we could read in the Los Angeles Times, by their most anti-communist foreign correspondent, living conditions are so much worse in the reform era that Bulgarians look back fondly on communism's good old days, when the hand of the state crushed personal freedom but ensured that people were housed, employed, and had enough to eat. But for Washington policymakers, the important thing, the ideological bottom line, was that the Bulgarian Socialist Party could not and would not be given the chance to prove that a democratic, socialist-oriented mixed economy could succeed in Eastern Europe while the capitalist model was failing all around it. Nor, apparently, would it be allowed in nearby Albania. On March 31st, 1991, a communist government won overwhelming endorsement in elections there. This was followed immediately by 2 months of widespread unrest, including street demonstrations and a general strike lasting 3 weeks, which finally led to the collapse of the new regime by June. The National Endowment for Democracy had been there also, providing $80,000 to the labor movement and $23,000 to support training and civic education programs. 52. Iraq 1990 to 1991. Desert Holocaust. This is the one part one didn't want to see, said a 20-year-old private. All the homeless, all the hurting. When we came through the refugee camp, man, that's something I didn't need. It's really sad, said the sergeant. We've got little kids come up and see my gun, and they start crying. That really tears me up. At night, you kill and you roll on by, said another GI. You don't stop. You don't have to see anything. It wasn't until the next morning the rear told us the devastation was total. We'd killed the entire division. While many nations have a terrible record in modern times of dealing out great suffering face-to-face with their victims, Americans have made it a point to keep at a distance while inflicting some of the greatest horrors of the age. Atomic bombs on the people of Japan, carpet bombing Korea back to the Stone Age, engulfing the Vietnamese in napalm and pesticides, providing 3 decades of Latin Americans with the tools and methods of torture, then turning their eyes away, closing their ears to the screams and denying everything, and now dropping 177 million pounds of bombs on the people of Iraq in the most concentrated aerial onslaught in the history of the world. What possessed the United States to carry out this relentless devastation for more than 40 days and nights against one of the most advanced and enlightened nations in the Middle East and its ancient and modern capital city? It's the first half of 1990. The dismantling of the Berlin Wall is being carried out on a daily basis. Euphoria about the end of the Cold War and optimism about the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity are hard to contain. The Bush administration is under pressure to cut the monster military budget and institute a peace dividend. But George Bush, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, former Texas oil man, and former director of the CIA, is not about to turn his back on his many cronies in the military-industrial intelligence complex. He rails against those who would naively cut the muscle out of our defense posture and insists that we must take a cautious attitude towards reform in the USSR. In February, it's reported that the administration and Congress are expecting the most acrimonious, hard-fought defense budget battle in recent history. And in June, that tensions have escalated between Congress and the Pentagon as Congress prepares to draft one of the most pivotal defense budgets in the past 2 decades. A month later, a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee votes to cut military manpower by nearly 3 times more than recommended by the Bush administration. The size and direction of the cuts indicate that President Bush is losing his battle on how to manage reductions in military spending. During this same period, Bush's popularity was plummeting, from an approval rating of 80% in January, as he rode the wave of public support for his invasion of Panama the previous month, to 73 in February, down to the mid-60s in May and June, 63 on July 11th, 62 weeks later. George Herbert Walker Bush needed something dramatic to capture the headlines and the public, and to convince Congress that a powerful military was needed as much as ever because it was still a scary and dangerous world out there. Although the official Washington version of events presented Iraq's occupation of neighboring Kuwait as an arbitrary and unwarranted aggression, Kuwait had actually been a district of Iraq under Ottoman rule up to the First World War. After the war, to exert leverage against the abundantly oil-rich Iraq, the British Colonial Office established tiny Kuwait as a separate territorial entity, in the process cutting off most of Iraq's access to the Persian Gulf. In 1961, Kuwait became independent, again because Britain declared it to be so, and Iraq massed troops at the border, backing down when the British dispatched their own forces. Subsequent Iraqi regimes never accepted the legitimacy of this state of affairs, making similar threats in the 1970s, even crossing a half-mile into Kuwait in 1976. But Baghdad was also open to a compromise with Kuwait under which Iraq would gain access to its former islands in the Gulf. The current conflict had its origins in the brutal 1980-88 war between Iraq and Iran. Iraq charged that while it was locked in battle, Kuwait was engaged in stealing $2.4 billion of oil from the Rumaila oil field that ran beneath the vaguely defined Iraq-Kuwait border and was claimed in its entirety by Iraq, that Kuwait had built military and other structures on Iraqi territory. And worst of all, that immediately after the war ended, Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates began to exceed the production quotas established by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, flooding the oil market and driving prices down. Iraq was heavily strapped and deeply in debt because of the long war, and Iraqi President Saddam Hussein declared this policy was an increasing threat to his country. Economic war, he called it, pointing out that Iraq lost $1 billion a year for each drop of $1 in the oil price. Besides compensation for these losses, Hussein insisted on possession of the 2 Gulf islands which blocked Iraq's access to the Gulf, as well as undisputed ownership of the Rumaila oil field. In the latter part of July 1990, after Kuwait had continued to scorn Iraq's financial and territorial demands, and to ignore OPEC's request to stick to its assigned quota, Iraq began to mass large numbers of troops along the Kuwaiti border. The reaction to all this by the world's only remaining superpower and self-appointed global policeman became the subject of intense analysis and controversy after Iraq actually invaded. Had Washington given Iraq a green light to invade? Was there, at a minimum, the absence of a flashing red light? The controversy was fueled by incidents such as the following. July 19th. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney stated that the American commitment made during the Iran-Iraq War to come to Kuwait's defense if it were attacked was still valid. The same point was made by Paul Wolfowitz, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, at a private luncheon with Arab ambassadors. Ironically, Kuwait had been allied with Iraq and feared an attack from Iran. Later, Cheney's remark was downplayed by his own spokesman, Pete Williams, who explained that the secretary had spoken with some degree of liberty. Cheney was then told by the White House, "You're committing us to war we might not want to fight," and advised pointedly that from then on, statements on Iraq would be made by the White House and State Department. July 24th, State Department spokeswoman Margaret Tutwiler, in response to a question, responded, "We do not have any defense treaties with Kuwait, and there are no special defense or security commitments to Kuwait." Asked whether the United States would help Kuwait if it were attacked, she said, "We also remain strongly committed to supporting the individual and collective self-defense of our friends in the Gulf with whom we have deep and long-standing ties." A statement that some Kuwaiti officials said privately was too weak. July 24th. The U.S. staged an unscheduled and rare military exercise with the United Arab Emirates, and the same Pete Williams then announced, "We remain strongly committed to supporting the individual and collective self-defense of our friends in the Gulf, with whom we have deep and long-standing ties." And the White House declared, "We're concerned about the troop buildup by the Iraqis. We ask that all parties strive to avoid violence." July 25th. Saddam Hussein was personally told by the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, in a now famous remark, that "we have no opinion on the Arab-Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait." But she then went on to tell the Iraqi leader that she was concerned about his massive troop deployment on the Kuwaiti border in the context of his government's having branded Kuwait's actions as parallel to military aggression. July 25th. John Kelly, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, killed a planned Voice of America broadcast that would have warned Iraq with the identical party line words, used by Tutwiler and Williams. July 27th. The House and Senate each voted to impose economic sanctions against Iraq because of its human rights violations. However, the Bush administration immediately reiterated its opposition to the measure. July 28th. Bush sent a personal message to Hussein, apparently after receiving Glaspie's report of her meeting with the Iraqi leader, cautioning him against the use of force, without referring directly to Kuwait. July 31st. Kelly told Congress, "We have no defense treaty relationship with any Gulf country. That is clear. We have historically avoided taking a position on border disputes or on internal OPEC deliberations." Then, Lee Hamilton asked if it would be correct to say that if Iraq charged across the border into Kuwait, the United States did not have a treaty commitment which would obligate us to engage U.S. forces there. "That is correct," Kelly responded. The next day, Washington time, Iraqi troops led by tanks charged across the Kuwaiti border, and the United States instantly threw itself into unmitigated opposition. Official statements notwithstanding, it appears that the United States did indeed have an official position on the Iraq-Kuwait border dispute. After the invasion, one of the documents the Iraqis found in a Kuwaiti intelligence file was a memorandum concerning a November 1989 meeting between the head of Kuwaiti State Security and CIA Director William Webster, which included the following. "We agreed with the American side that it was important to take advantage of the deteriorating economic situation in Iraq in order to put pressure on that country's government to delineate our common border. The Central Intelligence Agency gave us its view of appropriate means of pressure, saying that broad cooperation should be initiated between us on condition that such activities be coordinated at a high level. The CIA called the document a total fabrication. However, as the Los Angeles Times pointed out, the memo is not an obvious forgery, particularly since if Iraqi officials had written it themselves, they almost certainly would have made it far more damaging to US and Kuwaiti credibility. It was apparently real enough and damaging enough to the Kuwaiti foreign minister. He fainted when confronted with the document by his Iraqi counterpart at an Arab summit meeting in mid-August. When the Iraqi ambassador in Washington was asked why the document seemed to contradict US Ambassador Glaspie's avowal of neutrality on the issue, he replied that her remark was part and parcel of the setup. Was Iraq set up by the United States and Kuwait? Was Saddam provoked into his invasion, with the conspirators' expectation perhaps that it would not extend beyond the border area, so he could be cut down to the size both countries wanted? In February 1990, Hussein made a speech before an Arab summit which could certainly have incited or added impetus to such a plot. In it, he condemned the continuous American military presence in the Persian Gulf waters and warned that, if the Gulf people and the rest of the Arabs along with them fail to take heed, the Arab Gulf region will be ruled by American will. Further, that the US would dictate the production, distribution, and price of oil, all on the basis of a special outlook which has to do solely with US interests, and in which no consideration is given to the interests of others. In examining whether there was a conspiracy against Iraq and Saddam Hussein, we must consider, in addition to the indications mentioned above, the following. Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat has asserted that Washington thwarted the chance for a peaceful resolution of the differences between Kuwait and Iraq at an Arab summit in May, after Saddam had offered to negotiate a mutually acceptable border with Kuwait. The US was encouraging Kuwait not to offer any compromise, said Arafat, which meant there could be no negotiated solution to avoid the Gulf crisis. Kuwait, he said, was led to believe it could rely on the force of US arms instead. Similarly, King Hussein of Jordan revealed that just before the Iraqi invasion, the Kuwaiti foreign minister stated, "We are not going to respond to Iraq. If they don't like it, let them occupy our territory. We are going to bring in the Americans." And that the Kuwaiti emir told his military officers that in the event of an invasion, their duty was to hold off the Iraqis for 24 hours. By then, American and foreign forces would land in Kuwait and expel them. King Hussein expressed the opinion that Arab understanding was that Saddam had been goaded into invading, thereby stepping into a noose prepared for him. The emir refused to accede to Iraq's financial demands, instead offering an insulting $500,000 to Baghdad. A note from him to his prime minister before the invasion speaks of support of this policy from Egypt, Washington, and London. "Be unwavering in your discussions," the emir writes. "We are stronger than they. the Iraqis think. After the war, the Kuwaiti Minister of Oil and Finance acknowledged, "But we knew that the United States would not let us be overrun. I spent too much time in Washington to make that mistake and received a constant stream of visitors here. The American policy was clear. Only Saddam didn't understand it. But we have seen perhaps ample reason why Saddam would fail to understand." Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz declared that a sharp drop in the price of oil was something the Kuwaitis, with their vast investment holdings in the West, could easily afford, but which undercut the oil revenues essential to a cash-hungry Baghdad. "It was inconceivable," said Aziz, "that Kuwait could risk engaging in a conspiracy of such magnitude against a large, strong country such as Iraq, if it were not being supported and protected by a great power, and that power was the United States of America. There is, in fact, no public indication that the United States, despite its very close financial ties, tried to persuade Kuwait to cease any of its provocative actions against Iraq. And neither Washington nor Kuwait seemed terribly concerned about heading off an invasion. In the week prior to the Iraqi attack, intelligence experts were telling the Bush administration with increasing urgency that an invasion of at least a part of Kuwait was likely. These forecasts appear to have evoked little response from government agencies. During this period, Bush was personally briefed and told the same by CIA Director William Webster, who showed the president's satellite photos of the Iraqi troops massed near the Kuwaiti border. Bush reportedly showed little interest. On August 1st, the CIA's National Intelligence Officer for Warning Sick walked into the offices of the National Security Council's Middle East staff and announced, "This is your final warning. Iraq," he said, "would invade Kuwait by day's end," which they did. This, too, did not produce a rush to action. Lastly, a Kuwaiti diplomat stationed in Iraq before the invasion sent many reports back to his own government warning of an Iraqi invasion. These were ignored as well. His last warning had specified the exact date, Kuwaiti time, of August 2nd. After the war, when the diplomat held a press conference in Kuwait to discuss the government's ignoring of his warnings, it was broken up by a government minister and several army officers. In July, while all these warnings were ostensibly being ignored, the Pentagon was busy running its Computerized Command Post Exercise, CPX, initiated in late 1989 specifically to explore possible responses to the Iraqi threat, which, in the new war plan 1002-90, had replaced the Soviet threat. The exercise dealing with an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or both. At a War Games exercise at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, participants were also being asked to determine the most effective American response to a hypothetical invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. While at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, another war game involved identifying bombing targets in Iraq. And during May and June, the Pentagon, Congress, and defense contractors had been extensively briefed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies of Georgetown University on a study of the future of conventional warfare, which concluded that the most likely war to erupt requiring an American military response was between Iraq and Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. Another person who seems to have known something in advance was George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State and then returned to the Bechtel Corporation, the multinational construction giant. In the spring of 1990, Shultz convinced the company to withdraw from a petrochemicals project in Iraq. "I said something is going to go very wrong in Iraq and blow up, and if Bechtel were there, it would get blown up too. So I told them to get out." Finally, there was this disclosure in the Washington Post. Since the invasion, highly classified U.S. intelligence assessments have determined that Saddam took U.S. statements of neutrality as a green light from the Bush administration for an invasion. One senior Iraqi military official has told the agency CIA that Saddam seemed to be sincerely surprised by the subsequent bellicose reaction. On the other hand, we have the statement from Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz, who was present at the Glasby-Hussein meeting. She didn't give a green light, and she didn't mention a red light because the question of our presence in Kuwait was not raised. And we didn't take it as a green light that if we intervened militarily in Kuwait, the Americans would not react. That was not true. We were expecting an American attack on the morning of the 2nd of August. But one must be skeptical about so casual an attitude toward an American attack. And these remarks, in effect denying that Iraq was played for a sucker, must be considered in light of the Iraqi government's stubborn refusal for some time to admit the harm done to the country by U.S. bombing, and to downplay the number of their casualties. The Bush administration's position was that Iraq's Arab neighbors, particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, had urged the United States all along not to say or do anything that might provoke Saddam. Moreover, as Ambassador Glaspie emphasized, no one expected Hussein to take all of Kuwait, at most the parts he already claimed, the islands and the oil field. But, of course, Iraq had claimed all of Kuwait for a century. The invasion. When Iraq invaded, the time for mixed signals was over. Whatever devious plan, if any, George Bush may have been operating under, he now took full advantage of this window of opportunity. Within hours, if not minutes, of the border crossing, the United States began mobilizing. The White House condemned Iraq's action as a blatant use of military aggression, demanded the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all Iraqi forces, and announced that it was considering all options. While George Bush was declaring that the invasion underscores the need to go slowly in restructuring U.S. defense forces. Before 24 hours had passed, an American naval task force loaded with fighter planes and bombers was on its way to the Persian Gulf. Bush was seeking to enlist world leaders for collective action against Iraq. All trade with Iraq had been embargoed, all Iraqi and Kuwaiti assets in the United States had been frozen, and the Senate had decisively defeated efforts to end or freeze production of the B-2 stealth bomber after proponents seized on Iraq's invasion of Kuwait to bolster their case for the radar-eluting weapon. The attack, they said, demonstrates the continuing risk of war and the need for advanced weapons, said Senator Dole. If we needed Saddam Hussein to give us a wake-up call, at least we can thank him for that. One day after using Iraq's invasion of Kuwait to help save the high-tech B-2 bomber, senators invoked the crisis again Friday to stave off the mothballing of 2 World War II vintage battleships. Within days, thousands of American troops and an armored brigade were stationed in Saudi Arabia. It was given the grand name of Operation Desert Shield, and a heightened appreciation for America's military needs was the prevailing order of the day. Less than a year after political changes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union sent the defense industry reeling under the threat of dramatic cutbacks, executives and analysts say the crisis in the Persian Gulf has provided military companies with a tiny glimmer of hope. If Iraq does not withdraw and things get messy, it will be good for the industry. You will hear less rhetoric from Washington about the peace dividend, said Michael Lauer, an analyst with Kidder, Peabody and Company in New York. The possible beneficiaries of the crisis, added the Washington Post, cover the spectrum of companies in the defense industry. By September, James Webb, former Assistant Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Navy in the Reagan administration, felt moved to speak out. The president should be aware that, while most Americans are laboring very hard to support him, a mood of cynicism is just beneath their veneer of respect. Many are claiming that the buildup is little more than a Pentagon budget drill, designed to preclude cutbacks of an army searching for a mission as bases in NATO begin to disappear. Remarkably, yet another cynical former Assistant Secretary of Defense was heard from. Lawrence Korb wrote that the deployment of troops to Saudi Arabia seems driven more by upcoming budget battles on Capitol Hill than a potential battle against Saddam Hussein. But can anything be too cynical for a congressman stalking re-election? By the beginning of October, we could read, the political backdrop of the U.S. military deployment in Saudi Arabia played a significant role in limiting defense cuts in Sunday's budget agreement, halting the military spending free fall that some analysts had predicted 2 months ago, budget aides said. Capitol Hill strategists said that Operation Desert Shield forged a major change in the political climate of the negotiations, forcing lawmakers who had been advocating deep cuts on the defensive. The defense budget compromise would leave not only funding for Operation Desert Shield intact, but would spare much of the funding that has been spent each year to prepare for a major Soviet onslaught on Western Europe. Meanwhile, George Bush's approval rating had recovered. The first poll taken in August after the U.S. engagement in the Gulf showed a jump to 74%, up from 60% in late July. However, it seems that the American public needs the rush of a regular patriotic fix to maintain enthusiasm for the man occupying the White House. For by mid-October, due to Bush's extreme obfuscation of why the U.S. was in the Persian Gulf, The rating they granted him was down to 56. Since Bush's first month in office, it had never been lower, and it stayed close to that level until the citizenry's next patriotic invasion fix in January, as we shall see. Prelude to war. As Iraq went about plundering Kuwait and turning it into Iraqi Province 19, the United States was building up its military presence in Saudi Arabia and the surrounding waters, and employing a little coercion and history's most spectacular bribes, creating a coalition to support US-fostered United Nations resolutions and the coming war effort in a multitude of ways. A fig leaf of multinational respectability as Washington had created in Korea, Grenada, and Afghanistan for what was essentially an American mission, an American war. Egypt was forgiven many billions of dollars in debt, while Syria, China, Turkey, the Soviet Union, and other countries received military or economic aid and World Bank and IMF loans, had sanctions lifted, or were given other perks not only from the US but, under Washington's pressure, from Germany, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. As an added touch, the Bush administration stopped criticizing the human rights record of any coalition member. But Washington and the media were unhappy with Germany for not enthusiastically jumping on the war bandwagon. The Germans, who only yesterday were condemned as jackboot fascists marching through Poland, were now called cowards for marching for peace in large demonstrations. Washington pushed a dozen resolutions through the Security Council condemning Iraq, imposing severe economic sanctions, and getting authorization to wage war. Only Cuba and Yemen voted against any of them. When Yemen's delegate received some applause for his negative vote on the key use of force resolution of November 29th, U.S. Secretary of State Baker, who was presiding, said to his delegation, "I hope he enjoyed that applause, because this will turn out to be the most expensive vote he ever cast." The message was relayed to the Yemenis, and within days, the tiny Middle East nation suffered a sharp reduction in U.S. aid. UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar acknowledged that it was not a United Nations war. General Schwarzkopf, commander of the coalition forces, was not wearing a blue helmet. The American control of the United Nations prompted British political commentator Edward Pierce to write that the UN functions like an English medieval parliament. Consulted, shown ceremonial courtesy, but mindful of divine prerogative, it mutters and gives assent. The paramount issue in the United States soon became, how long should we wait for the sanctions to work before resorting to direct military force? The administration and its supporters insisted that they were giving Hussein every chance to find a peaceful, face-saving way out of the hole he had dug himself into. But the fact remained that each time President Bush made the Iraqi leader any kind of offer, it was laced with a deep insult, and never offered the slightest recognition that there might be any validity to Iraq's stated grievances. Indeed, Bush had characterized the Iraqi invasion as being without provocation. The president's rhetoric became increasingly caustic and exaggerated. He was putting it on a personal level, demonizing Saddam as he had done with Noriega, as Reagan had done with Gaddafi, as if these foreigners did not have pride or reason like Americans have. Here's how the Los Angeles Times viewed it. Shortly after Iraq's invasion, Bush carefully compared Iraq's aggression with the German aggression against Poland that launched World War II. But he stopped short of a personal comparison of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein with Adolf Hitler. That caution went out the window last month, when Bush not only compared Hussein to Hitler, but also threatened Nuremberg-style war crime trials. Then, last week, Bush went further, briefly maintaining that the Iraqi leader is worse than Hitler because the Germans never held US citizens as human shields at military sites. After this trivializing of the Holocaust, Bush went on to warn that any acceptance of uncontrolled aggression could be World War tomorrow. Said one of his own officials, "Got to get his rhetoric under control." Saddam Hussein could not help but soon realize that by seizing all of Kuwait, not to mention sacking and pillaging it, he had bitten off substantially more than he could chew. In early August and again in October, he signaled his willingness to pull Iraqi forces out of the country in return for sole control of the Rumaila oil field, guaranteed access to the Persian Gulf, the lifting of sanctions, and resolution of the oil price/production problem. He also began to release some of the many foreigners who had had the misfortune of being in Iraq or Kuwait at the wrong time. In mid-December, the last of them was freed. Earlier that month, Iraq began laying out a new Iraqi-Kuwait border, which might have meant a renunciation of its claim of Kuwait being a part of Iraq, though its meaning was not clear. And in early January, as we shall see, his strongest peace signal was reported. The Bush administration chose to not respond in a positive manner to any of these moves. After Saddam's August offer, the State Department categorically denied it had even been made. Then the White House confirmed it. A later congressional summary of the matter stated, the Iraqis apparently believed that having invaded Kuwait, they would get everyone's attention, negotiate improvements to their economic situation, and pull out. A diplomatic solution satisfactory to the interests of the United States may well have been possible since the earliest days of the invasion. The Bush administration, said the congressional paper, wanted to avoid seeming in any way to reward the invasion. But a retired Army officer, who was acting as a middleman in the August discussions, concluded afterward that the peace offer was already moving against policy. After a certain point in the American military buildup, could the United States have given peace a chance even if it wanted to? Former Assistant Defense Secretary Lawrence Korb observed in late November that all the components of the defense establishment were pushing to get in on the action, to prove their worth, to prove that there was still a need for them, to assure their continued funding. By mid-January, the United States will have over 400,000 troops in the Gulf. It turned out to be over 500,000 from all 5 armed services. Yes, even the Coast Guard is there. This is about 100,000 more troops than we had in Europe at any time during the Cold War. The Army will eventually have 8 divisions on the ground in Saudi Arabia, twice as many as it had in Europe. 2/3 of the entire Marine Corps' combat power will be there. The Navy will deploy 6 of its 14 aircraft carrier battle groups, 2 of its 4 battleships, and 1 of its 2 amphibious groups. The Air Force already has fighters from 9 of its 24 active tactical wings, as well as bombers. Even the combat reserves are scheduled to be sent. The reserve lobby recognized that their future funding may be jeopardized if their units do not get involved. Just as every service wants to be involved in the deployment, will not each want a piece of the real action? And would the military high command be able to resist the pressures from each service, Korb wondered. The Navy, which had moved some of its carriers into the narrow and dangerous waters of the Gulf just to be closer to the action. The Marines, who might want to demonstrate the continuing viability of amphibious warfare by staging an assault on the coast. And could the Army lay back while air power carried the day? They couldn't, and it prolonged the war. The US military and President Bush would have their massive show of power, their super high-tech real war games, and no signals from Iraq or any peacenik would be allowed to spoil it. Fortune magazine, in an ingenuous paean to Bush's fortitude, later summed up the period before the war began thusly. The president and his men worked overtime to quash freelance peacemakers in the Arab world, France, and the Soviet Union, who threatened to give Saddam a face-saving way out of the box Bush was building. Over and over, Bush repeated the mantra: no negotiations, no deals, no face-saving, no rewards, and specifically, no linkage to a Palestinian peace conference, a point raised by Iraq on several occasions. On November 29th, the UN Security Council authorized the use of all necessary means to compel Iraq to vacate Kuwait if it didn't do so by January 15th. Over Christmas, we have learned George Bush pored over every one of the 82 pages of Amnesty International's agonizing report of Iraqi arrests, rape, and torture in Kuwait. After the holiday, he told his staff that his conscience was clear. It's black and white, good versus evil. The man has to be stopped. It's not reported whether Bush ever read any of Amnesty's many reports of the period on the equally repulsive violations of human rights and the human spirit perpetrated by Washington's allies in Guatemala, El Salvador, Afghanistan, Angola, and Nicaragua. If he did, the literature apparently had little effect, for he continued to support these forces. Amnesty had also been reporting about Iraq's extreme brutality for more than a decade, and only a few months before the August invasion had testified about these abuses before the Senate. But none of this had filled George Bush with righteous indignation. As the January 15th deadline neared, the world held its breath. Was it possible that in 5.5 months no way could have been found to avoid inflicting another ghastly war upon this sad planet? On the 11th, Arab diplomats at the UN said that they had received reports from Algeria, Jordan, and Yemen, all on close terms with Iraq, that Saddam planned an initiative soon after the 15th that would express his willingness in principle to pull out of Kuwait in return for international guarantees that Iraq would not be attacked, an international conference to address Palestinian grievances, and negotiations on disputes between Iraq and Kuwait. The Iraqi leader, the diplomat said, wanted to wait a day or two after the deadline had passed to demonstrate that he had not been intimidated. For the United States, with 500,000 troops poised for battle in Saudi Arabia, this was unacceptable. Saddam Hussein will pass the brink at midnight, January 15th, said Secretary of State Baker, and could not expect to save himself by offering to pull out of Kuwait after that time. The multiple explanations of George Bush, our jobs, our way of life, our own freedom, and the freedom of friendly countries around the world will suffer if control of the world's great oil reserves fell in the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein. Thus spaketh George Herbert Walker Bush to the people of America. As Theodore Draper observed, these reasons were both mundane and implausible. That jobs should have been mentioned first suggested that Bush, as in a domestic political campaign, sought primarily to appeal to the voter's pocketbook. It was, however, a peculiarly crass reason to go to war, if it came to that halfway around the world. During the entire lengthy build-up to the war, during the war, after the war, no one was sure they understood why Bush had intervened in the Persian Gulf, and then taken the United States into war. Congressmen, journalists, editors, plain citizens kept asking, almost pleading at times, for the president to clearly and unambiguously explain his motivations, and without contradicting what he had said the previous week. Economists and think tank intellectuals found it professionally awkward to admit their uncertainty, and thus wound up writing lots of authoritative-sounding mumbo-jumbo. The prevailing bewilderment prompted the Wall Street Journal to assemble a group of voters to discuss the issues. They are confused about what's happening and are crying out for more information, reported the newspaper about the participants. And they are unsettled by the perception that Mr. Bush seems to be switching his reasoning day to day, said one participant. So far it's been like David Letterman's top 10 reasons for being there. There's a different story every week or so. Taking place in the Persian Gulf, as it all did, of course lent itself to the belief that the liquid gold had a lot, if not everything, to do with the conflict. This, however, is a thesis which cannot be supported by the immediate circumstances. Supply was not a problem. The Energy Department acknowledged that there was not an oil shortage, and Saudi Arabia and other countries increased their production to more than make up for the oil lost from Iraq and Kuwait, which, in any event, together accounted for only about 5% of American consumption. There was a whole world ready to supply more oil from Mexico to Russia, as well as large untapped American sources. This indicates the difficulties faced by any single producer, Hussein or anyone else, who might try to control or dominate the market, which in turn raises the question, what would such a country do with all the oil? Drink it. By December, it was reported that OPEC is pumping oil at the highest levels since early summer, and unless a war in the Middle East disrupts supplies, there's a prospect again of an oil glut and sharply lower prices. As to the price of oil, did oilman George Bush and James Baker and the depressed American oil states want it to go up or down? A case could be made for either hypothesis. In January 1990, the U.S. had secretly urged Saddam to try to raise the OPEC oil price to $25 a barrel, and how easily could Washington control it either way in a chaotic situation? As it is, oil prices fluctuate on a regular basis, often sharply. Between 1984 and 1986, for example, the price of a barrel of oil fell from around $30 to less than $10, despite the ongoing Iraq-Iran war which cut into the production of both countries. However, this analysis of the immediate circumstances does not take into consideration the formidable and continual influence of the mystique of oil upon the thinking of American policymakers. If Bush was looking for a crisis to impress upon the congressional mind the enduring danger of the world we live in, then getting involved in a conflict between two major oil-producing countries would certainly generate the desired effect much more readily than if he had seized upon Bolivia attacking Paraguay or Ghana occupying Ivory Coast. The president's remark about the American way of life and everyone's freedom reflects the life and death seriousness that he and other policymakers publicly ascribe to oil. What these men really believe and feel in each instance is something we are not privy to. Earlier in the year, CIA Director William Webster had told Congress that oil will continue to have a major impact on U.S. interests because Western dependence on Persian Gulf oil will rise dramatically in the next decade. While General Schwarzkopf, who had lifelong ties to the Middle East, testified, "Mideast oil is the West's lifeblood. It fuels us today, and being 77% of the free world's proven oil reserves, is going to fuel us when the rest of the world has run dry." It is estimated that within 20 to 40 years, the US will have virtually depleted its economically available oil reserves, while the Persian Gulf region will still have at least 100 years of proven oil reserves. It was actually 69% at the time, and since the Soviet Union has joined the free world, it's even less. It should also be noted that the good general's prediction for the US is rather speculative, and that the term economically available is a reference to the fact that US domestic oil reserves are more costly to exploit than those in the Gulf. But this only makes it a profit problem, not an oil supply problem. Moreover, the vast potential residing in alternative energy sources must be included in the equation. At this time, the United States, seemingly in a panic about danger to the Gulf oil supply, was receiving about 11% of its oil from the region, while Japan, which got 62% of its oil, and Europe, which got 27% from there, were hardly stirred up at all, except for Margaret Thatcher, who foamed at the mouth when it came to Saddam and former colony Iraq. Germany's figure was about 35%, yet both Bonn and Tokyo had to have their arms twisted by Washington to support the war effort. The two countries may, in fact, have been leery about helping the United States acquire greater influence and control over the region's oil. Official Washington's embrace of the oil mystique has given rise to a long-standing policy, expressed as follows by political analyst Noam Chomsky. It's been a leading, driving doctrine of U.S. foreign policy since the 1940s that the vast and unparalleled energy resources of the Gulf region will be effectively dominated by the United States and its clients, and, crucially, that no independent indigenous force will be permitted to have a substantial influence on the administration of oil production and price. This has not always meant the use of force. In 1973, when OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, used substantial price increases and an oil boycott in an attempt to force Washington to influence Israel into withdrawing from its recently occupied territories, the United States did not launch or even threaten an invasion. The matter was resolved through extensive diplomacy without a shot being fired. What saved the OPEC states from a violent fate may have been the combination of the Vietnam War still hanging heavy in the air in Washington, and the Nixon administration on the verge of being swallowed up by Watergate. In addition to issuing several dire warnings early on about the invasion's severe economic consequences for the United States, which never came to pass, Bush warned of an even worse fate if Iraq took over Saudi Arabia. The danger to Saudi Arabia explanation was a non-starter. Iraq never had any designs on Saudi Arabia, as a simple look at a map makes clear. The Iraqis have a long border with that country. They didn't have to go through Kuwait to invade the Saudis, and even if they did, they could have moved into Saudi Arabia virtually unopposed during the 3 weeks following their takeover of Kuwait, as General Colin Powell later conceded. Bush administration officials in fact admitted that neither the CIA nor the Defense Intelligence Agency thought it probable that Iraq would invade Saudi Arabia. The Saudis didn't think so either, until Defense Secretary Cheney flew to Riyadh on August 5th and personally told King Fahd that his country stood in great potential danger and desperately needed a very large infusion of American military forces to defend it. Bush backed away from the oil rationale when critics charged that he was only trying to protect the interests of the oil industry. In October, he was interrupted while making a speech by some people calling out, "Mr. President, bring our troops home from Saudi Arabia. No blood for oil," to which George Bush replied, as the hecklers were hustled out, "You know, some people never get the word. The fight isn't about oil. The fight is about naked aggression that we will not stand." A month later, if not sooner, the president again began to play the oil card, tying America's economic security to that of Saudi Arabia. Shortly afterward, he returned to the devastating damage being done every day to the US and international economies by the disruption of oil markets. As to Iraq's naked aggression, a remark requiring selective memory skills of a high order coming from a government that held all modern records for international aggression, naked or otherwise, and from a man who, less than a year before, had nakedly invaded Panama. Both Syria and Israel had invaded Lebanon and still occupied large portions of that country, Israel bombarding Beirut mercilessly in the process, without a threat of war emanating from Washington. Saddam Hussein, perhaps wondering when they had changed the rules, said to the United States, "You are talking about an aggressive Iraq. If Iraq was aggressive during the Iran War, why then did you speak with us then?" During Iraq's epic struggle against the Ayatollah Khomeini, the United States, of course, had more than spoken to Baghdad. Washington, choosing Iraq as the lesser evil against Shiite extremism, was responsible for huge amounts of weaponry, military training, sophisticated technology, satellite photo intelligence, and billions of dollars reaching a needy Hussein, who was also lavishly supported by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, they being concerned that Iran's anti-monarchist sentiments might spread to their own realms. Indeed, there is evidence that Washington encouraged Iraq to attack Iran and ignite the war in the first place. And during this period of American support of Hussein, he was certainly the same odious, repressive, beastly thug as when he later came under American moralistic rhetorical fire. Similarly, absent Washington's prodding, the UN did not condemn Iraq's invasion, nor did it impose any sanctions or lay down any demands. Even as it officially banned arms sales to either combatant, the US secretly provided weapons to both. The other bête noire of the region, the Ayatollah, received American arms and military intelligence on Iraq during the war, so as to enhance the ability of the two countries to inflict maximum devastation upon each other and stunt their growth as strong Middle East nations. In contrast to Iraq, the enemy now were the two allies most involved, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Although Washington did not make a big thing about the virtue of either country, official policy was always that the United States had a principled commitment to defending the former and liberating the latter. And they were not a pretty pair. Saudi Arabia regularly featured extreme religious intolerance, extrajudicial arrest, torture, and flogging. It also practiced gender apartheid and systematic repression of women, virtual slavery for its foreign workers, stoning of adulterers, and amputation of the hands of thieves. U.S. chaplains stationed in the country were asked to remove crosses and stars of David from their uniforms and call themselves morale officers. Kuwait, oddly enough, was virulently anti-American in its foreign policy. Though more socially enlightened than Saudi Arabia, but less than Iraq, it was nonetheless run by one family as an elitist oligarchy, which closed down the parliament in 1986, had no political parties, and forbade criticism of the ruling emir. No more than 20% of the population possessed any political rights at all. After the country had been returned to its rightful dictators, it behaved very brutally toward its large foreign worker population, holding them without charge or trial for several months. Death squads executed scores of people. Torture of political detainees was routine and widespread, said Amnesty International, and at least 80 disappeared in custody. The targets of the campaign, which took place in the presence of thousands of US troops, were primarily those who were accused of collaboration with the Iraqis, although this was something most of them had no choice in, and those who were involved in a nascent pro-democracy movement. Additionally, some 400 Iraqis were forced to return to Iraq despite fears that they would be harmed or executed there. The elite of the region did not display much gratitude for all that George Bush said America was doing for them. Said one Gulf official, "You think I want to send my teenage son to die for Kuwait?" He chuckled and added, "We have our white slaves from America to do that." A Saudi teacher saw it this way, "The American soldiers are a new kind of foreign worker here. We have Pakistanis driving taxis, and now we have Americans defending us." Explaining the absence of express gratitude on the part of Gulf leaders, a Yemeni diplomat said, "A lot of the Gulf rulers simply do not feel that they have to thank the people they've hired to do their fighting for them. Apart from anything else, people in the Arab world were very sensitive about the killing of Muslims and Arabs by foreigners, as well as foreign military presence on Arab soil, a reminder of a century of Western white colonialism." Bush also warned that Iraq posed a nuclear threat. True enough, but so did the United States, France, Israel, and every other country that already had nuclear weapons. Iraq, on the other hand, according to American, British, and Israeli experts, was 5 to 10 years away from being able to build and use nuclear weapons. It's unlikely that the president himself believed there was any such danger. His warning came only after a poll showed that a plurality of Americans felt that preventing Iraq from acquiring nuclear weapons was the most persuasive argument for going to war. One factor not mentioned by Bush as a reason for the intervention, but which, in fact, probably played an important role, was the Pentagon's desire to make or strengthen agreements with Gulf region countries for an ongoing U.S. military presence, and considerable progress along these lines appears to have been made. General Schwarzkopf had earlier told Congress that U.S. presence in the Gulf is one of the three pillars of overall military strategy, along with security assistance and combined exercises, all of which lead to all-important access, which one can take as a euphemism for influence and control. After the war, the existence of a network of military communication systems, superbases, in Saudi Arabia was revealed. 10 years in the building by the United States in maximum secrecy, its cost of almost $200 billion paid for by the Saudis, its use during the Gulf War indispensable, it may explain why Bush moved so quickly to defend Saudi Arabia, albeit against a non-existent threat. Stop me before I kill again. Joseph Stalin studied for the priesthood. Adolf Hitler was a vegetarian and anti-smoking. Hermann Goering, while his Luftwaffe rained death upon Europe, kept a sign in his office that read, "He who tortures animals wounds the feelings of the German people." This fact Elie Wiesel called the greatest discovery of the war. That Adolf Eichmann was cultured, read deeply, played the violin. Mussolini also played the violin. Charles Manson was a staunch anti-vivisectionist. About Panama, as we have seen, after he ordered the bombing, George Bush said that his heart goes out to the families who have died in Panama. And when he was asked, was it really worth it to send people to their death for this? To get Noriega? He replied, "Every human life is precious, and yet I have to answer, yes, it has been worth it." About Iraq, Bush said, "People say to me, how many lives? How many lives can you expend? Each one is precious." Just before ordering the start of the war against Iraq in January, Bush prayed as tears ran down his cheeks. "I think," he later said, "that like a lot of others who had positions of responsibility in sending someone else's kids to war, we realized that in prayer what mattered is how it might have seemed to God. God, one surmises, might have asked George Bush about the kids of Iraq, and the adults, and in a testy, rather ungodlike manner, might have cracked, 'So stop wasting all the precious lives already.' Tanks pulling plows moved alongside trenches, firing into the Iraqi soldiers inside the trenches as the plows covered them with great mounds of sand. Thousands were buried, dead, wounded, or alive. U.S. forces fired on Iraqi soldiers after the Iraqis had raised white flags of surrender. The Navy commander who gave the order to fire was not punished. The bombing destroyed 2 operational nuclear reactors in Iraq. It was the first time ever that live reactors had been bombed, and may well have set a dangerous precedent. Hardly more than a month had passed since the United Nations, under whose mandate the United States was supposedly operating, had passed a resolution reaffirming its prohibition of military attacks on nuclear facilities in the Middle East. Sundry chemical, including chemical warfare, facilities, and alleged biological warfare plants, were also targets of American bombs. General Schwarzkopf then announced that they had been very careful in selecting the means of destruction of these as well as the nuclear facilities, and only after a lot of advice from a lot of very, very prominent scientists, and were 99.9% certain that there was no contamination. However, European scientists and environmentalists detected traces of chemical weapons agents that the bombings had released, as well as chemical fallout and toxic vapors, also released by the air attacks that were killing scores of civilians. The American government and media had a lot of fun with an obvious piece of Iraqi propaganda, the claim that a bombed biological warfare facility had actually been a baby food factory. But it turned out that the government of New Zealand and various business people from there had had intimate contact with the factory and categorically confirmed that it had indeed been a baby food factory. The United States also made wide use of advanced depleted uranium, DU, shells, rockets, and missiles, leaving tons of radioactive and toxic rubble in Kuwait and Iraq. The United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, in an April 1991 secret report, warned that if DU gets in the food chain or water, this will create potential health problems. The uranium-238 used to make the weapons can cause cancer and genetic defects if inhaled. Uranium is also chemically toxic, like lead. Inhalation causes heavy metal poisoning or kidney or lung damage. Iraqi soldiers, pinned down in their bunkers during assaults, were almost certainly poisoned by radioactive dust clouds. The civilian population suffered in the extreme from the relentless bombing. Middle East Watch, the human rights organization, has documented numerous instances of the bombing of apartment houses, crowded markets, bridges filled with pedestrians and civilian vehicles, and a busy central bus station, usually in broad daylight, without a government building or military target of any kind in sight, not even an anti-aircraft gun. On February 12th, the Pentagon announced that virtually everything militarily is either destroyed or combat ineffective. Yet the next day, there was a deliberate bombardment of a civilian air raid shelter that took the lives of as many as 1,500 civilians, a great number of them women and children. This was followed by significant bombardment of various parts of Iraq on a daily basis for the remaining 2 weeks of the war, including what was reported for the 18th in the Guardian of London as one of the coalition's most ferocious attacks on the center of Baghdad. What was the purpose of the bombing campaign after the 12th? The United States said it thought that the shelter was for VIPs, which it had been at one time, and claimed that it was also being used as a military communications center. But neighborhood residents insisted that the constant aerial surveillance overhead had to observe the daily flow of women and children into the shelter. Western reporters said they could find no signs of military use. An American journalist in Jordan who viewed unedited videotape footage of the disaster, which the American public never saw, wrote, "They showed scenes of incredible carnage. Nearly all the bodies were charred into blackness. In some cases, the heat had been so great that entire limbs were burned off. Rescue workers collapsed in grief, dropping corpses. Some rescuers vomited from the stench of the still smoldering bodies," said White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater after the bombing of the shelter. "It was a military target. We don't know why civilians were at this location, but we do know that Saddam Hussein does not share our value in the sanctity of life," said George Bush when criticized for the bombing campaign. "I am concerned about the suffering of innocents. The crippling of the electrical system multiplied geometrically the daily living horror of the people of Iraq." As a modern country, Iraq was reliant on electrical power for essential services such as water purification and distribution, sewage treatment, the operation of hospitals and medical laboratories, and agricultural production. Bomb damage, exacerbated by shortages attributable to the UN/US embargo, dropped electricity to 3 or 4% of its pre-war level. The water supply fell to 5%. Oil production was negligible. The food distribution system was devastated. The sewage system collapsed. Flooding houses with raw sewage and gastroenteritis and extreme malnutrition were prevalent. 2 months after the war ended, a public health team from Harvard University visited health facilities in several Iraqi cities. Based on their research, the group projected, conservatively, that at least 170,000 children under 5 years of age will die in the coming year from the delayed effects of the destruction of electrical power, fuel, and transportation. A large increase in deaths among the rest of the population is also likely. The immediate cause of death in most cases will be waterborne infectious disease in combination with severe malnutrition. One member of both the Harvard group and a later research group which visited Iraq testified before Congress that children play in the raw sewage which is backed up in the streets. 2 world-renowned child psychologists stated that the children in Iraq were the most traumatized children of war ever described, despite repeated statements by American authorities about taking the greatest of care to hit only military targets, using smart bombs and laser-guided bombs and surgical strikes. We now know that this was little more than an exercise in propaganda, just as referring to this suffering as collateral damage was. After the war, the Pentagon admitted that non-military facilities had been extensively targeted for political reasons. Comprehensive post-World War II government studies had concluded that the dread of disease and the hardships imposed by the lack of sanitary facilities were bound to have a demoralizing effect upon the civilian population, and that there was a reliable and striking correlation between the disruption of public utilities and the willingness of the German population to accept unconditional surrender. In the Iraqi case, there was a further motivation to encourage desperate citizens to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Said a U.S. Air Force planner, "Big picture, we wanted to let people know, get rid of this guy and we'll be more than happy to assist in rebuilding. We're not going to tolerate Saddam Hussein or his regime. Fix that, and we'll fix your electricity." Those who tried to escape the bombing horror in Iraq by fleeing to Jordan were subjected to air attacks on the highway between Baghdad and the Jordanian border. Buses, taxis, and private cars were repeatedly assaulted, literally without mercy, by rockets, cluster bombs, and machine guns. Usually in broad daylight, the targets clearly civilian with luggage piled on top, with no military vehicles or structures anywhere to be seen. Surrounded by open desert, the attacking planes flying extremely close to the ground, busloads of passengers incinerated. And when people left the vehicles and fled for their lives, planes often swooped down upon them, firing away. "You're killing us," cried a Jordanian taxi driver to an American reporter. "You're shooting us everywhere we move." Whenever they see a car or truck, the planes dive out of the sky and chase us. They don't care who we are or what we are. They just shoot. His cry was repeated by hundreds of others. The U.S. military, it appears, felt that any vehicle, including those filled with families, might be a cover for carrying military fuel or other war material, some perhaps related to Scud missiles, and even carrying civilian fuel was a violation of the embargo. At the very end, when the hungry, wounded, sick, exhausted, disoriented, demoralized, ragged, sometimes barefoot Iraqi army, which had scarcely shown any desire to fight, left Kuwait and headed toward Basra in southern Iraq, Saddam tried to salvage a pathetic scrap of dignity by announcing that his army was withdrawing because of special circumstances. But even this was too much for George Bush to grant. "Saddam's most recent speech is an outrage," declared the president forcefully. "He is not withdrawing. His defeated forces are retreating. He is trying to claim victory in the midst of a rout. This could not be permitted." Thus it was that American air power in all its majesty swept down upon the road to Basra, bombing, rocketing, strafing everything that moved in the long column of Iraqi military and civilian vehicles, troops and refugees. The nice, God-fearing, wholesome American GIs, soon to be welcomed as heroes at home, had a ball. We toasted him. We hit the jackpot. A turkey shoot. This morning was bumper to bumper. It was the road to Daytona Beach at spring break, and spring breaks over. Again and again, as loudspeakers on the Carrier Ranger blared Rossini's William Tell Overture, the rousing theme song of the Lone Ranger, one strike force after another took off with their load of missiles and anti-tank and anti-personnel rock-eye cluster bombs, which explode into a deadly rain of armor-piercing bomblets. Land-based B-52s joined in with 1,000-pound bombs. It's not going to take too many more days until there's nothing left of them. Shooting fish in a barrel. Basically just sitting ducks. There's just nothing like it. It's the biggest 4th of July show you've ever seen. And to see those tanks just boom. And more stuff just keeps spewing out of them. They just become white hot. It's wonderful. The British Daily, The Independent, although it supported the war, denounced the glee with which the Americans carried out the barrage, saying it turned the stomachs and was sickening to witness a routed army being shot in the back. A BBC radio reporter summed up the attack by asking, "What threat could these pathetic remnants of Saddam Hussein's beaten army have posed? Wasn't it obvious that the people of the convoy would have given themselves up willingly without the application of such ferocious weaponry? And all this against a foe that had for 5 days been calling for a ceasefire. But heaven forbid that the Americans should offend any of the people of the Gulf." Thus it was that GIs were taught things like never to use their left hand when offering food or drink, for that hand is traditionally reserved for sanitary functions, and the proper way to beckon an Arab with one's hand and fingers so as not to confuse it with beckoning a dog. We also have the story of the American pilot who, during an earlier bombing operation, stuffed into his identification packet a $20 bill and a note written in Arabic, Farsi, Turkish, and English. It said, "I am an American and do not speak your language. I bear no malice toward your people." Then he was off, roaring through the skies toward Iraq with his payload of bombs. Did the GIs bear any malice toward their female soldiers in arms? One post-war study found that more than half the women who served in the Gulf War felt that they had been sexually harassed verbally, while 8%, almost 3,000, had been the objects of attempted or completed sexual assaults. And immediately after George Bush ordered the bombing to begin, his rating with the American people jumped for joy. An 82% approval rating, the highest ever in his 2 years in office, higher even than after his invasion of Panama. One journalist later noted, "1 minute of nightly truth on this popular war would have changed American public opinion. If for just 60 seconds the 6 o'clock Monday news had shown 5,000 Iraqi soldiers with hideous phosphorus burns that alter human anatomy, followed by 60 seconds Tuesday night of the slaughter at the Baghdad bomb shelter. What if on Wednesday Americans had seen 10,000 Iraqi soldiers incinerated by American high-tech weapons?" Ever since the Iraqi invasion in August, and despite the many confusing sound bites and heavy rhetoric emanating from the White House, one thing seemed clear enough. If Iraq agreed to withdraw from Kuwait, military attacks against it would not take place, or would cease, whatever other punishment or sanctions might continue. Thus, it seemed like a ray of hope, however late, when the Soviet Union succeeded on 21 to 22 February 1991 in getting Iraq to agree to withdraw completely the day after a ceasefire of all military operations went into effect. The agreement came with specified timetables and monitoring. George Bush refused to offer a ceasefire, per se. He could not even bring himself to mention the word in his replies. All he would say was that the retreating Iraqi forces would not be attacked, which turned out to be untrue, and that the coalition will exercise restraint. Saddam could have chosen to take this as the ceasefire, but he was as proud and stubborn as George. The point Bush emphasized the most during these 2 crucial days, as well as earlier, was that Iraq must comply with all 12 UN resolutions. In evaluating Bush's legalistic demands, it should be kept in mind that the policy and practice of the American war had repeatedly violated the letter and the spirit of the United Nations Charter, the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, the Nuremberg Tribunal, the protocols of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the US Constitution, amongst other cherished documents. In the end, Bush gave Saddam 24 hours to begin withdrawing from Kuwait, period. When the time came and went, the United States launched the long-expected ground war, while the aerial attacks, including the carnage on the road to Basra, continued until the end of the month, said Vitaly Ignatenko, a spokesman for Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. It seems that President Gorbachev cares more about saving the lives of American soldiers than George Bush does. In a post-war survey, a United Nations inspection team declared that the Allied bombardment had had a near-apocalyptic impact on Iraq and had transformed the country into a pre-industrial age nation, which had been until January a rather highly urbanized and mechanized society. It will never be known how many hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died from the direct and indirect effects of the war. The count is added to every day. With the United States refusing to end the embargo against Iraq, everything has continued. Malnutrition, starvation, lack of medicines and vaccines, contaminated drinking water, human excrement piling up, typhoid, a near epidemic of measles, several other diseases. Iraq's food supply had been 70% dependent on imports. Now billions of dollars were frozen in overseas accounts, and with prohibitive restrictions on selling its oil. An inability to rebuild because vital parts could not be imported. Industry closing its doors, mass unemployment, transportation and communications broken down. By September 1994, with Washington still refusing to release its death grip on the embargo, the Iraqi government announced that since the sanctions had begun in August 1990, about 400,000 children had died of malnutrition and disease. After the war, when the Iraqi government was repressing a Kurdish revolt, which the US had encouraged, then failed to support, Bush said, "I feel frustrated any time innocent civilians are being slaughtered." This was the second time the United States had led the Kurdish lambs to slaughter with a broken commitment. See Iraq 1972 to 75 chapter. Washington had also encouraged the Shiite Muslims in Iraq to rebel, then did not back them. The US was not looking to foster a Kurdish government that would upset Turkey, nor a Shiite government that might well become an ally of Iran or inspire Muslim fundamentalists elsewhere in the Middle East. American mental hospitals and prisons are home to many people who claim to have heard a voice telling them to kill certain people they'd never met before, people who'd never done them any harm or threatened any harm. American soldiers went to the Persian Gulf to kill the same kind of people after hearing a voice command them. The voice of George Herbert Walker Bush.
53, Afghanistan 1979 à 1992.
America's Jihad. His followers first gained attention by throwing acid in the faces of women who refused to wear the veil. CIA and State Department officials I have spoken with call him Scary, vicious, a fascist, definite dictatorship material. This did not prevent the United States government from showering the man with large amounts of aid to fight against the Soviet-supported government of Afghanistan. His name was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He was the head of the Islamic Party, and he hated the United States almost as much as he hated the Russians. His followers screamed, "Death to America," along with death to the Soviet Union. Only the Russians were not showering him with large amounts of aid. The United States began supporting Afghan Islamic fundamentalists in 1979, despite the fact that in February of that year some of them had kidnapped the American ambassador in the capital city of Kabul, leading to his death in the rescue attempt. The support continued even after their brother Islamic fundamentalists in next-door Iran seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in November and held 55 Americans hostage for over a year. Hekmatyar and his colleagues were, after all, in battle against the Soviet evil empire. He was thus an important member of those forces Ronald Reagan called freedom fighters. On April 27, 1978, a coup staged by the People's Democratic Party, PDP, overthrew the government of Mohammed Daoud. Daoud, 5 years earlier, had overthrown the monarchy and established a republic, although he himself was a member of the royal family. He had been supported by the left in this endeavor, but it turned out that Daoud's royal blood was thicker than his progressive water. When the Daoud regime had a PDP leader killed, arrested the rest of the leadership, and purged hundreds of suspected party sympathizers from government posts, the PDP, aided by its supporters in the army, revolted and took power. Afghanistan was a backward nation. A life expectancy of about 40, infant mortality of at least 25%, absolutely primitive sanitation, widespread malnutrition, illiteracy of more than 90%, very few highways, not 1 mile of railway, most people living in nomadic tribes or as impoverished farmers in mud villages, identifying more with ethnic groups than with a larger political concept. A life scarcely different from many centuries earlier. Reform with a socialist bent was the new government's ambition. Land reform, while still retaining private property, controls on prices and profits, and strengthening of the public sector, as well as separation of church and state, eradication of illiteracy, legalization of trade unions, and the emancipation of women in a land almost entirely Muslim. Afghanistan's thousand-mile border with the Soviet Union had always produced a special relationship. Even while it was a monarchy, the country had been under the strong influence of its powerful northern neighbor, which had long been its largest trading partner, aid donor, and military supplier. But the country had never been gobbled up by the Soviets, a fact that perhaps lends credence to the oft-repeated Soviet claim that their hegemony over Eastern Europe was only to create a buffer between themselves and the frequently invading West. Nevertheless, for decades Washington and the Shah of Iran tried to pressure and bribe Afghanistan in order to roll back Russian influence in the country. During the Daoud regime, Iran, encouraged by the United States, sought to replace the Soviet Union as Kabul's biggest donor with a $2 billion economic aid agreement, and urged Afghanistan to join the Regional Cooperation for Development, which consisted of Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey. This organization was attacked by the Soviet Union and its friends in Afghanistan as being a branch of CENTO, the 1950s Regional Security Pact that was part of the US policy of containment of the Soviet Union. At the same time, Iran's infamous secret police, SAVAK, was busy fingering suspected communist sympathizers in the Afghan government and military. In September 1975, prodded by Iran, which was conditioning its aid on such policies, Daoud dismissed 40 Soviet-trained military officers and moved to reduce future Afghan dependence on officer training in the USSR by initiating training arrangements with India and Egypt. Most important, in Soviet eyes, Daoud gradually broke off his alliance with the PDP, announcing that he would start his own party and ban all other political activity under a projected new constitution. Selig Harrison, the Washington Post South Asia specialist, wrote an article in 1979 entitled, "The Shah, Not the Kremlin, Touched Off Afghan Coup," concluding, "The communist takeover in Kabul April 1978 came about when it did, and in the way that it did, because the Shah disturbed the tenuous equilibrium that had existed in Afghanistan between the Soviet Union and the West for nearly 3 decades. In Iranian and American eyes, Tehran's offensive was merely designed to make Kabul more truly non-aligned, but it went far beyond that. Given the unusually long frontier with Afghanistan, the Soviet Union would clearly go to great lengths to prevent Kabul from moving once again toward a pro-Western stance. When the Shah was overthrown in January 1979, the United States lost its chief ally and outpost in the Soviet border region, as well as its military installations and electronic monitoring stations aimed at the Soviet Union. Washington's Cold Warriors could only eye Afghanistan even more covetously than before. After the April Revolution, the new government under President Nur Muhammad Turaki declared a commitment to Islam within a secular state and to non-alignment in foreign affairs. It maintained that the coup had not been foreign-inspired, that it was not a communist takeover, and that they were not communists but rather nationalists and revolutionaries. No official or traditional communist party had ever existed in Afghanistan. But because of its radical reform program, its class struggle and anti-imperialist type rhetoric, its support of all the usual suspects, Cuba, North Korea, etc., its signing of a friendship treaty and other cooperative agreements with the Soviet Union, and an increased presence in the country of Soviet civilian and military advisors, though probably less than the US had in Iran at the time. It was labeled communist by the world's media and by its domestic opponents. Whether or not the new government in Afghanistan should properly have been called communist, whether or not it made any difference what it was called, the lines were now drawn for political, military, and propaganda battle. A jihad, holy war, between fundamentalist Muslims and godless atheistic communists. Afghan nationalism versus a Soviet-run government. Large landowners, tribal chiefs, businessmen, the extended royal family, and others versus the government's economic reforms. Said the new prime minister about this elite, who were needed to keep the country running, every effort will be made to attract them, but we want to re-educate them in such a manner that they should think about the people, and not, as previously, just about themselves, to have a good house and a nice car while other people die of hunger. The Afghan government was trying to drag the country into the 20th century. In May 1979, British political scientist Fred Halliday observed that probably more has changed in the countryside over the last year than in the 2 centuries since the state was established. Peasant debts to landlords had been cancelled. The system of usury, by which peasants, who were forced to borrow money against future crops, were left in perpetual debt to moneylenders, was abolished, and hundreds of schools and medical clinics were being built in the countryside. Halliday also reported that a substantial land redistribution program was underway, with many of the 200,000 rural families scheduled to receive land under this reform already having done so. But this last claim must be approached with caution. Revolutionary land reform is always an extremely complex and precarious undertaking even under the best of conditions, and ultra-backward, tradition-bound Afghanistan in the midst of nascent civil war hardly offered the best of conditions for social experiments. The reforms also encroached into the sensitive area of Islamic subjugation of women by outlawing child marriage and the giving of a woman in marriage in exchange for money or commodities, and teaching women to read at a time when certain Islamic sectors were openly calling for the reinforcement of purdah, the seclusion of women from public observation. Halliday noted that the People's Democratic Party saw the Soviet Union as the only realistic source of support for the long overdue modernization. The illiterate Afghan peasants' ethnic cousins across the border in the Soviet Union were, after all, often university graduates and professionals. The argument of the Mujahideen, holy warriors, rebels that the communist government would curtail their religious freedom was never borne out in practice. A year and a half after the change in government, the conservative British magazine The Economist reported that no restrictions had been imposed on religious practice. Earlier, the New York Times stated that the religious issue is being used by some Afghans who actually object more to President Turaki's plans for land reforms and other changes in this feudal society. Many of the Muslim clergy were in fact rich landowners. The rebels, concluded a BBC reporter who spent 4 months with them, are fighting to retain their feudal system and stop the Kabul government's left-wing reforms which are considered anti-Islamic. The 2 other nations which shared a long border with Afghanistan and were closely allied to the United States expressed their fears of the new government. To the west, Iran, still under the Shah, worried about threats to oil passage routes in the Persian Gulf. Pakistan, to the south, spoke of threats from a hostile and expansionist Afghanistan. 2 months after the April 1978 coup, an alliance formed by a number of conservative Islamic factions was waging guerrilla war against the government. By spring 1979, fighting was taking place on many fronts, and the State Department was cautioning the Soviet Union that its advisors in Afghanistan should not interfere militarily in the civil strife. One such warning in the summer by State Department spokesman Harding Carter was another of those Washington monuments to chutzpah. We expect the principle of non-intervention to be respected by all parties in the area, including the Soviet Union. This while the Soviets were charging the CIA with arming Afghan exiles in Pakistan, and the Afghanistan government was accusing Pakistan and Iran of also aiding the guerrillas and even of crossing the border to take part in the fighting. Pakistan had recently taken its own sharp turn towards strict Muslim orthodoxy, which the Afghan government deplored as fanatic, while in January, Iran had established a Muslim state after overthrowing the Shah. As opposed to the Afghan fundamentalist freedom fighters, the Iranian Islamic fundamentalists were regularly described in the West as terrorists, ultra-conservatives, and anti-democratic. A favorite tactic of the Afghan freedom fighters was to torture victims, often Russians, by first cutting off their noses, ears, and genitals, then removing one slice of skin after another, producing a slow, very painful death. The Mujahideen also killed a Canadian tourist and 6 West Germans, including 2 children, and a U.S. military attaché was dragged from his car and beaten, all due to the rebels' apparent inability to distinguish Russians from other Europeans. In March 1979, Taraki went to Moscow to press the Soviets to send ground troops to help the Afghan army put down the Mujahideen. He was promised military assistance, but ground troops could not be committed. Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin told the Afghan leader, "The entry of our troops into Afghanistan would outrage the international community, triggering a string of extremely negative consequences in many different areas. Our common enemies are just waiting for the moment when Soviet troops appear in Afghanistan. This will give them the excuse they need to send armed bands into the country." In September, the question became completely academic for Noor Mohammad Taraki, for he was ousted and his death soon announced, in an intra-party struggle and replaced by his own deputy prime minister, Hafizullah Amin. Although Taraki had sometimes been heavy-handed in implementing the reform program and had created opposition even amongst the intended beneficiaries, he turned out to be a moderate compared to Amin, who tried to institute social change by riding roughshod over tradition and tribal and ethnic autonomy. The Kremlin was unhappy with Amin. The fact that he had been involved in the overthrow and death of the much-favored Taraki was bad enough. But the Soviets also regarded him as thoroughly unsuitable for the task that was Moscow's sine qua non, preventing an anti-communist Islamic state from arising in Afghanistan. Amin gave reform an exceedingly bad name. The KGB station in Kabul, in pressing for Amin's removal, stated that his usurpation of power would lead to harsh repressions and, as a reaction, the activation and consolidation of the opposition. Moreover, as we shall see, the Soviets were highly suspicious about Amin's ideological convictions. Thus it was that what in March had been unthinkable